So let me jump right in because we have a lot to cover. Let me just begin for a few minutes with explaining what the IMF actually does. And after that, you asked me to talk about the global economy and how we see the economy evolving. And I'll turn to that after some few introductory slides on the role of the IMF. Let me just load the presentation. Can you see my slides?
Clear.
I'm sharing this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you see the slides or the entire screen?
Only slide. Can you make it full screen?
Yeah, okay. Because I can't see what I'm actually, what you are seeing. Do you see it now, the full slide?
We cannot see the full slide.
Let me try again. Okay. Like now you should be seeing myself as well as my slides, right? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Figured it out. So again, thank you for having me. Just a few words on the IMF, what we are actually doing. The IMF was founded in 1944 in a small town in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States. There was a conference where the Allies discussed institutions for a post-World War economic order. And a key driver behind that was to avoid a situation that we had in the 1930s, where countries were pursuing economic policies that were harmful to other countries. So you might have heard that in the 1930s, the United States, when it was in the deep recession, it imposed tariffs on imports from across the world. And that had an impact on many countries across the world and really contributed to spreading the economic depression. So that was the impetus behind coming together after, or Second World War was still going on in 44, but people were already thinking about the world order post-World War, where they wanted to ensure that there are global institutions that can help with global economic cooperation and that help countries avoid harmful economic policies. So what are we really doing? There are three main things the IMF does. First of all, we give policy advice to member countries. We lend money to countries that are in trouble. You can think of this as countries that cannot really pay for their imports, that are running out of foreign exchange. In these situations, we are coming in and we provide emergency loans to countries. And then the third point, which is often overlooked, is capacity development. This is actually the biggest part of our activities when it comes to our budget. is helping countries to improve their economic institutions, their economic policies, their economic frameworks. On the policy advice side, we have country teams these are teams of economists for every country in the world. And every country in the world is a member of the IMF, with the exception of North Korea and Cuba. And as a member of the IMF, a country has the obligation to engage with the IMF in an annual consultation. And in this annual consultation, an IMF team looks at all aspects of the macroeconomy of a country and then publishes a report. This report is called Article 4. So when you, for example, go online in Google and just Google IMF Vietnam Article 4, you will find our report from last year, which has a lot of detail on the Vietnamese economy, on policy advice. And you would find a similar document for almost every country in the world. We also do multilateral surveillance, which means not just looking at a specific country, but we have reports on developments in regions such as Asia or Africa. And we have global reports that look at, for example, the global growth developments, global financial stability, or fiscal developments. And our role here as analysts and as advisors to governments is really that of a truth teller. In our publications, of course, we have to be diplomatic, but we try to give good, unbiased advice to policymakers in countries. On the second function that I mentioned, lending, let me just explain how the IMF works. You can think of the IMF pretty much like a credit union. So when we are lending money to a country in trouble, we don't have the money sitting in an account. What we are doing is we take money from other member countries that are in a strong financial position, for example, Japan, Germany, or the United States, and we then transfer that money to a country that would be in trouble. And this lending doesn't come for free. It has an interest rate. The interest rate depends on the level of development of the country. So poorer countries have to pay lower interest rates. Richer countries have to pay higher interest rates. In addition to this, there's something called conditionality. What conditionality is that when we are lending money, there are things the country needs to do to get that money. So every quarter, for example, when the country wants to get a fresh amount of money from the loan, they would have to meet certain criteria. And these criteria are designed by the IMF to solve the economic problems that the country is facing. So just to give you a concrete example, I worked on a loan we had for Jamaica, island in the Caribbean. They had big problems with very high government debt, high unemployment, and too much fiscal spending. And this was a big success. The country is now much more stable, has really reduced its debt. And I remember some of the conditions we would, for example, require Jamaica to fulfill were to improve the business environment, to make it easier for new companies to register. Another condition was to raise certain taxes, the value-added tax, for example. Typical conditions also include, for example, freezing public sector wages so that there are less government expenditures. And this is really critical, this element of conditionality. So the IMF is not just there to give money, it's really there to help the country solve its problems. And I mentioned the third role that we are playing already. This is capacity development. In my view, this is extremely important because it really helps countries in the long term to improve their economic policy making and their economic situation. It gets a lot less attention than our lending because it's happening usually when a country is not in crisis. It's much more behind the scenes. It's very technical. To give you some examples, in Vietnam, we engage in technical assistance in many areas. For example, we've been working with the State Bank of Vietnam now for many years in modernizing monetary policy. Another example would be to work with the government on improving economic data. And I don't want to go into details, but compiling economic data is actually very complicated. When you, for example, want to measure the trade of a country, it gets very complicated, and we have experts that work with statistical agencies in countries to improve this data. So let me stop with this introduction about the IMF here. As you can remember, 3 functions. We do economic analysis and advice, we do lending, and we do capacity development. Let me now pull up the actual presentation, which is about how we see economic developments globally and the outlook. 1 second, please. Okay, can you see a slide saying global economic developments and outlook? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So let me now turn to this presentation. And I have a lot of material here and a lot of very technical looking slides. I believe your professors are sharing the slides, so you can take a closer look if you like. I'm going to jump over some of these issues and try to focus more on big picture messages. So where do we stand in the global economy? If we take a step back over the last, let's say, 5 years, you all remember that very unfortunate time of COVID-19, the pandemic, which had huge economic implications. And you can see that here on the right hand, in the middle chart, where it says real GDP, this is real economic growth, indexed to 100 in the 4th quarter of 2020. And you see this big drop, which is COVID-19. So across the world, as the pandemic hit, economic growth turned deeply negative because people could not travel, they could not go to restaurants, factories had to shut down. So all that really deeply affected economic growth. Now, the rebound in most countries after these initial lockdowns was actually quite rapid. And again, when you focus on this real GDP chart, which is interesting here is, despite the drop-off related to COVID-19, when you look at the trend, we are basically on the trend before COVID. And this is a major achievement. What it tells you is that there hasn't been that much damage, at least on a global level, to economic growth from COVID-19. And there are reasons for that. And primarily, I would say, we haven't seen too much long-lasting damage from COVID-19 to economies because of very strong policy action. Especially fiscal support was in many countries, especially advanced economies, very strong during COVID. There was a lot of government spending, and there in many advanced economies, there continues to be a lot of fiscal spending. Also, monetary policy reacted and was very supportive. So that is really a positive takeaway, where policy has made a difference and has really helped the global economy to get back on its pre-COVID growth track. The second thing, big picture I want to point out is inflation. I'm sure you all have heard a lot about rising cost of living, higher inflation rates. This started in 2021, and then inflation peaked at very high levels in many countries in early 2022. And inflation, when you look back at the previous decade, in advanced economies, inflation was not an issue. It was rather about deflation in Japan, for example, or very low inflation in Europe and even in the United States. So we haven't, in advanced economies, we hadn't seen a spike in inflation really since the late 70s, early 1980s. And this posed challenges for policymakers. But as you can see, inflation has declined worldwide in advanced economies and also in most emerging markets. So I should say the yellow line here in both charts, what we call EMDE, this stands for emerging and developing economies. So inflation has worldwide come down. Now, with this broad picture on inflation and growth, let me talk about some specific developments. So I mentioned already that growth really has been surprisingly strong, and the recovery from COVID, after COVID, had been surprisingly strong. As I mentioned, a big part of that was very strong government spending. And what happened there is, because people couldn't really spend money during COVID, you might remember that you were spending a lot of time at home watching TV, Netflix, sitting at the computer, so people generally were spending less. And at the same time, in many countries, especially in advanced economies, they were getting, in some cases, checks directly from the government. Or even if they didn't get checks, they were spending less than in normal times. So you had a lot of people saving more. And these accumulated savings were very substantial. You can see that in the chart here on the right-hand side for advanced economies. Savings reached around 10% of GDP. So these are very large savings that people had, and that they then, when the economies were opening up, could spend. And all this spending was helping with the economic recovery and with GDP growth. Now, that effect was much weaker in developing countries and emerging markets, simply because there was a lot less government support, so people could not save as much. I also mentioned monetary policy. On the left-hand side, you can see a policy rate for selected countries. The United States, for example, in dark blue. And then the gray dotted line here, these are global emerging and developing countries. And when you look on the left, in early 2020, when COVID started, central banks reacted as they should. They were cutting interest rates. And low interest rates are supportive for the economy, and that also helped to cushion the blow from COVID. Then we had, as I mentioned, inflation increasing in late 21, and again, central banks reacted to that by raising interest rates. Another factor that really has helped, especially in advanced economies, is immigration. They've actually seen a big expansion in the labor force in the US and Canada especially, but also in the UK and the Euro area. And if you have more people working, that helps with economic growth. Supply chain pressures, that's another thing you might remember from COVID times. Because of COVID restrictions, containers were stuck in harbors, ships could not move around, trucking was affected. So that created both inflation, because transport was much more expensive, and it also affected GDP growth because there was simply less activity. Now, that also has normalized for the most part, although there are new risks emerging, especially related to the conflict in the Middle East. And I will talk more about that later in the outlook. Another benefit to the global economy were falling energy prices. Oil prices, after peaking in early or mid 2022, came down quite substantially. And this is despite all the geopolitical conflicts we've seen. You jump over this. Just want to say specifically on emerging markets. The situation for emerging markets would say over the last year has been difficult in the sense that because interest rates were high in the United States and other advanced economies, that usually tends to lead to capital flowing from emerging markets to the United States. And what that means is it creates pressure on the exchange rate of developing countries. And we've seen that across Asia over the last year or two, that most Asian currencies have depreciated against the United States. Now, this has so far not led to any problems or accidents, and central banks in Asia at least have managed this quite well. And this is exactly also the right policy response that we would recommend at the IMF, is to actually let exchange rate fluctuate, because that serves as a shock absorber. If an exchange rate depreciates, it makes a country's exports more competitive, and that should rebalance a country's economy. Now, it's not all rosy coming out of COVID. And one legacy of COVID is very high government debt in many countries. Now, I say many because there are exceptions, and actually Vietnam is an important exception. In Vietnam, government debt is fairly low. But that example aside, in most advanced economies, government debt is at much higher levels than before COVID because governments were spending a lot during COVID. And we have a good number of emerging markets, and especially developing countries, that have unsustainably high debt levels coming out of COVID. And these tend to be smaller frontier type markets. So in Asia, for example, you might have heard that Sri Lanka has been facing a crisis and is receiving IMF support. Nepal is another country in Asia, Mongolia. Many African countries are struggling with very high debt levels post-COVID and had to restructure their debt or default in some cases on debt. So high debt burdens are a big issue coming out of COVID. Now, with that, let me talk about how we see the economy evolving going forward. First, when we talk about any economic forecast, we have to make clear what are our assumptions. And I'm not showing you everything, but two key assumptions. First, on monetary policy on the left-hand side, we are expecting interest rates in major economies to decline. The one exception is Japan. But we think that in the United States, the Federal Reserve, in Europe, the European Central Bank, and also the Bank of England will start cutting interest rates sometime probably towards the end of this year. Now, in the medium term, we think interest rates will remain higher than they were before COVID. And there are a number of reasons for that. We think something has, to some extent, changed in economic dynamics that will lead to slightly higher inflation than before COVID, and therefore the need for higher policy rates. And one very important factor in advanced economies is more government spending. And the second factor is trade wars, tariffs, reallocation of exchange of supply chains, all of which tends to be inflationary. So at least for now, we think interest rates will not fall back to close to zero as they were before COVID. Now, on fiscal policy, our assumption is that at least the big advanced economies that are still running very large budget deficits will start to consolidate and run smaller budget deficits. Now, with these assumptions, what's the growth outlook? Let's spend a little bit of time on this slide. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the growth outlook for, in black, the world. In blue are advanced economies, and in this reddish color are emerging and developing economies. And our forecast for the world is around 3.2, 3.3% pretty much for the next 5 years. Now, advanced economies growth is lower, around 1.6, 1.7%, and emerging markets growth is forecast in the range between 4 and 4.5%. Now, you might ask, why is advanced economy growth so much lower? This is actually generally the case. Richer countries tend to, on average, grow slower than poorer countries. There are a number of reasons for that. One big one here is demographics. Demographics is a big driver of long-term growth developments. And a lot of advanced economies have aging societies, shrinking workforces. For example, in Japan or in Germany, my home country, the workforce is already shrinking. So that has a negative effect on growth. On the other hand, most emerging and developing countries like Vietnam tend to have fairly young populations, still growing workforces, and that simply increases overall growth. A second reason why poorer countries tend to grow faster is an argument of convergence. So the idea behind that is that when you are a poor country, you're growing, it's easier to grow in the sense that you can copy technology, you can import technology. If you're a very poor country that goes from agriculture, the first industry is typically textiles. That's much easier to do than being a very advanced economy that has to innovate to develop new industries. So this kind of convergence argument is also usually made to explain why poorer countries tend to grow faster. Now, I should have one big caveat here. I'm showing you aggregate numbers for emerging and developing countries, the red line. There's a lot of difference across regions. You can see that here on the right-hand side, where there's a breakdown of the growth rate for emerging and developing countries by region. You see in blue on top, this is emerging Asia. Then in light blue is SSA, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. In green is the Middle East and Central Asia. The reddish line is emerging Europe, and the yellow line is Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, Asia is by far the fastest growing region. And especially if you focus on 2024, you can see that Asia, developing Asia, this excludes Korea and Japan, is growing at 5+%, way outperforming the rest of developing countries and emerging markets. Now, Africa, for example, is growing much slower. And even that growth rate for Africa, you have to keep in mind that Africa has the fastest growing population. So a lot of the growth in Africa is actually driven by simply larger populations. And the point I want to make here is that what I said before, that poor countries tend to grow faster than rich countries, it's not always the case. And actually, we have a lot of countries in the world right now, poor countries, that are falling behind, that are growing slower than advanced economies. And this is it's a big problem for development. And we can talk about that later if you like in the question and answer. There are reasons for that. But generally, we have seen outside of Asia that convergence, meaning developing countries catching up to advanced economies, has slowed in the last decade. The second point I want to make on the growth outlook is that global GDP growth, no matter whether you look at advanced economies or at developing countries, emerging markets, has been slowing over the last 25 years. So while we are projecting 3.2% or so for the next years in global growth, this compares to more than 4% back in 2000, or from 2000 to 2000, around 12, 13. The world was growing almost a percentage point faster than it is now growing. And you see when you focus on the left-hand side on the black line, there's a clear downward trend in global growth. Now, part of that is simply explained by demographics. World population is growing slower, and that globally is a good thing. But there are also other factors going on that are worrisome. So part of this slowdown in global growth in all countries is slower productivity growth. Productivity simply means how much can one worker produce, or if you have a machine, how much output does that one machine generate? So how much do you get out of your labor and capital resources? And that has been slowing. And that is a big factor in slower global growth. And this is something that is worrisome because it makes it harder to, of course, generate wealth. It makes it harder for low-income countries to catch up. And it's something that economists are working hard on to understand. Why is productivity slowing on a global scale in the last decade? Let me not spend really time on specific numbers because I think there's often way too much focus on specific numbers in the news, on TV and news articles. People like to focus on, let's say here, world GDP growth of 3.2% in 2024. Now, let me explain why I think there's too much focus on that. Two issues. First of all, economic forecasts are very imprecise. If you think about it in statistical terms, the error terms or the confidence intervals around economic forecasts are very, very wide. It's simply impossible to really forecast what will happen in global growth 2 or 3 years down the line. Forecastability is better in the short term for a few quarters, but once you make long-term growth forecasts, there's just a lot of error. And there, of course, you can make some very good assumptions by simply looking at the size of the labor force, how much investment, you make assumptions on productivity growth. But really, again, the error terms are very wide. And if you take one thing away from this, always keep that in mind. When people are too precise and give you very precise growth numbers or inflation numbers, it's not very useful because there is so much error in the estimation and the forecasts. The second issue is why I don't like too much precision in economic forecasts, that measuring something as GDP is actually very, very complicated. And statistical agencies employ many people collecting many different data series. And they compile all this data and then they make estimates and extrapolations. So even in growth numbers that are published, there are usually very large revisions. So again, as new data comes in, sometimes this happens in all advanced economies. It's not just developing countries. There's a first GDP release, then there's a second one or a third one, fourth one. Sometimes 2 or 3 years later, numbers are still revised. So that's why I caution to focus too much on very specific numbers. What is much more important are trends and roughly ballpark numbers. So what I mean there is, for example, what is interesting in 2024 is that the US is growing almost 2.5 times faster than the euro area. That's interesting. But the exact number, whether the US growth is 2.4, 2.5, 2.6, that is really not that important. Just on inflation, because that's a big policy debate. I mentioned inflation was reaching very high levels in 2022. It's come down across the world, both advanced economies and emerging markets. And central banks have done a fairly good job in managing this. And we expect inflation to continue to come down. But again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do think inflation will be structurally in the next years a bit higher than it was before COVID. Let me talk about a few special topics. Now, I talked a lot about forecasts and data, and I think these charts are great to illustrate my point. What this is, the red line on the left-hand side is our growth forecast, and then you have confidence, statistical confidence, probability intervals around the forecast. And each shade of blue is a 5% probability. So you can see the enormous uncertainty in both inflation and growth forecast once you go beyond half a year out. So again, that's why I would de-emphasize specific numbers, and trends are much more important. And why are economic forecasts so difficult? Why is there so little predictability? Well, because there are so many things in the world and so many events that can happen that are unpredictable. I mean, who in 2019 would have thought that a pandemic will stop the world economy? Who really predicts a few years ahead financial crisis? Very few people. And then the economy as a system is so complex, so many things can happen that even with the most modern machine learning models, etc., you don't get much better predictability. So let me now, in the last minutes of my presentation, talk a little bit about some of the risks we see, mostly on the downside, but also perhaps some upside risks. First risk we could see where global economic growth will be much weaker, and which might especially impact low-income and emerging markets that import commodities, would be a spike in commodity prices. And the main factor in this would be some major conflict escalation in the Middle East. For example, if something where material would happen between Iran and its proxies and Israel, that, for example, could drive up oil prices. Higher oil prices tend to be bad for the world economy. Second risk factor, especially for Asia, is China. You might have heard that the Chinese economy has been relatively weak. Chinese growth has slowed quite a bit in recent years. Part of that is natural. Part of it is demographics. The Chinese population actually, for the first time in recent months, has started to decline. So China is aging. The workforce and population now is shrinking. But there are other issues that really weigh on the Chinese economy. And one big one is the real estate sector. The real estate sector has been the driver of growth in China, but because there has been so much investment in real estate, so much construction, there's oversupply. And this real estate bubble now is deflating, and both real estate prices, sales, and investment have been falling, and that is weighing on the entire economy. In addition, China has a fairly unbalanced economy in the sense that consumption is relatively low in China when you compare it to other countries, and the share of national income that goes towards investment, especially in manufacturing, is fairly high. And as a result, China has overcapacity in some sectors, for example, in solar panels. I think you could argue in electric vehicles. So there's oversupply of good. And one of the results of this oversupply is falling prices. So in China finds itself in a situation where not just real estate prices are falling, but also consumer prices. On top of that, China, of course, faces trade frictions, especially with the United States, but also to some extent with other countries, including Europe. Can you still hear me? No? is a, yeah, because
Yeah,
some of my microphone went on mute apparently. Yeah, so this is China is in a difficult spot, and this has big implications for Asia, both negative as well as positive. And again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Vietnam, for example, has benefited actually from some of the trade challenges China faces because Chinese factories have moved to Vietnam as an alternative production location. And that leads me to another risk, which is, we call it fragmentation risk. What that really means is that this open borders when it comes to trade, that we see more and more restrictions. These can be either direct tariffs or restrictions that are related to quality requirements, things that impede trade across borders. And overall, that's a risk because we know that overall global trade is beneficial for economic growth. Of course, there can be winners and losers among countries. There can be winners and losers within countries, and that needs to be managed. But overall, when you have trade and when you have countries focusing on comparative advantages, that tends to raise overall global wealth. And with increasing trade restrictions, that could weigh on global growth going forward. Another downside risk relates to political instability. And this affects many countries in the world. We have, for example, in the US, but also in Europe, increasing polarization, extreme political positions, I would say, and gain more voting share. But you also have political, for example, in Bangladesh, we recently had a change in government. So why do I talk about this? Because it affects economic policy. If governments, if there's more populist policy making, it often leads to bad economic decisions. One example here are fuel subsidies. Many countries in the world, especially poorer countries, are giving out fuel subsidies, which is a really bad use of government money. Let me explain why. Because fuel subsidies usually don't benefit the poorest. So if you want to support poor people, there are much better ways than fuel subsidies. They often benefit rich people more. The second reason is most countries have climate change targets, and they might be investing in tackling climate change. At the same time, they subsidize fuel. So overall, this is really bad policy, but there are political reasons why governments do it. So any increase in polarization, any increase in populist economic policy making tends to be often bad economic policy. Now, one upside risk that people are talking a lot about is artificial intelligence. Look, I think it's difficult to quantify how much that will do, especially in the short term. But there is a hope that artificial intelligence will increase productivity again. And we saw that, for example, in the 2000s when the internet came first. It took a few years, but then we saw a boost in productivity. And I think it's very likely that artificial intelligence in a few years will do the same. AI has the capacity to really improve productivity of office workers. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with AI tools. And for example, I'm in my job, I'm using AI to draft simple emails, to help me restructure texts, to generate charts. So this can really be, as the technology gets better, and as you see on the right-hand side, the speed of improvement in AI has really been accelerating. I think that can be globally a big boost to productivity. Let me just wrap up with our big picture policy recommendations on a global scale. So it's really hard to generalize because it depends on specific country conditions. But I think overall, given that inflation still has a bit to go down to get back to central bank targets, the first order for central banks is to ensure a smooth landing. A smooth landing means to bring inflation to a target without crashing the economy. And so far, it looks pretty good. But who knows? But so far, central banks have done a very good job. The second policy priority is to rebuild fiscal space, meaning countries need to bring government debt down. So when there is another big crisis, they have money to spend. The third point is, I mentioned productivity growth has been declining across countries over the last decade. We need policies to bring productivity growth back up. And what are those policies? It is very long-term difficult things. It's investment in infrastructure, it's investment in education, it is improvements in the business climate, it is reducing bureaucracy, it involves making, for example, easier to start a business, but it also includes reducing red tape, reducing corruption. But this is, for long-term growth, this is really key. A fourth policy priority on the global scale is we need to tackle climate change. The science on climate change is very clear. We know that climate change is man-made. It's maybe difficult to imagine something that happens 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, but we know there are big economic damages coming from climate change, and the signs are already there. So we need to move to low carbon emissions across the globe, and that will require a lot of investment in decarbonizing industry, transport, and energy production. And it also, especially for developing countries, means investments into dealing with the impacts of climate change, because there will be some climate change. It's too late to contain climate change fully. So poor countries especially should invest into things like ensuring that seashores are protected from erosion, or that there are measures to manage flooding. And the last policy point at a global scale is we need cross-border cooperation among countries. And globally, we are moving in the opposite direction. There's less global cooperation, but we know that, for example, on the economic side with trade is overall beneficial. We need cooperation on climate change. A lot of the global problems can only be addressed when countries work together. Let me stop here so we have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Justin, for your outstanding presentations. So it is full of rich content, facts and figures. So hope students will enjoy it. Now session open for question and answer sessions. So I'm welcome to students as well as few faculty also join here. Dr. Richard and Hua. So please, you have questions, you can ask or you can type in chat message. Yeah, Richard having one question. Yeah, please, Richard.
Hey, Jochen. Firstly, thank you for what. Let me reiterate Deepak's contribution, this was an excellent, presentation. I want to ask this question because I don't think I'll ever have another opportunity to ask this question to somebody from the IMF. And you kind of mentioned it in terms of the risks. It's actually two questions. The first question is related to how the IMF manages economies that seem not to listen to the advice that you give them. And there are two reactions. One, you could say the developed countries. And so recently we heard, for instance, in the US elections, Trump suggesting that a 60% tariff will be implemented on China even before the elections. And this is something that could really cause imbalance in the economic system if he is elected. And then on the other spectrum are countries like Argentina, which seems to not really, I would say, be consistent with the advice that they're being given, even though they're being supported by institutions like the IMF. So the question is, how does the IMF navigate that reality in terms of doing its job, which is protecting the global financial system and the integrity of the countries? The second question is related to Vietnam in particular. I'm not from Vietnam, I'm from the Caribbean. So I was pleased to hear about the intervention you made to Jamaica. But one of the things that struck me about Vietnam is economic stability. Even during COVID-19, it was one of the few Southeast Asian economies that actually didn't decline significantly, and it remained robust. And so, in your opinion, from where you sit, what do you see as the strengths of the Vietnam economy and probably the risks moving forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, for these excellent questions. Let me take the first one first. This is really an excellent question. So when we have a country that needs IMF support, needs IMF lending, that's when we can have much more influence. Because we're only giving the money if the country meets agreed criteria. So usually money is dispersed every quarter. And I also should explain, we are the lender of last resort globally. So countries come to the IMF when they cannot get money anywhere else. Nobody else is going to lend to that country. So in that sense, the country has no choice. And therefore, they renegotiate these program targets, the things that a country needs to do, and because it's linked to the flow of money, we actually have quite a bit of impact. Now, that being said, in my experience, even in these cases, it only works if the government is really committed to improving the situation. And there's lots of analysis of IMF programs, and the IMF gets a lot of criticism sometimes for imposing harsh conditions on a country. But important to keep in mind that we are only coming in when the situation is already really bad. And there are really only bad choices in many cases. And I mentioned Jamaica, and Jamaica is such a great example because in Jamaica, there was broad political agreement to work with the IMF and to solve the problems. And it ended up being a fantastic success story against all odds. There was recently an Economist article about Jamaica because it was so unlikely to succeed, and yet it did. And I really think the difference in Jamaica was broad political support. We had a shift in government. Opposition came in during the program. They were also committed. They also brought in civil society, the trade unions. We were meeting them regularly. So there was really broad buy-in. Now, the opposite example would be, I guess, Argentina, where the IMF has given many loans over the last decades. And you could, I think, say that it has been failure after failure. And I think a lot of it comes down to politics. If there is no clear commitment by the government and ownership, in the end, we can just give the money and can give advice. Implementation has to come from the government. So if they're not on board, it's not going to work. Now, what about the cases where we are not providing financing, such as the US imposing tariffs? Quite frankly, there's very little we can do. We can state our opinion. It might make it into the press, but we have no tools to force a country to, for example, not engage in these harmful policies. There are some areas that IMF member countries have agreed to. For example, when it comes to capital controls, where we have a little bit of influence, but most of it is naming and shaming. So it is limited in that sense. And I guess peer pressure. Peer pressure is an important aspect of it. But yeah, politics definitely plays into it. And you can imagine that especially the bigger countries, it is even harder to have influence than on smaller countries. I think that's just a fact of the matter. Now on Vietnam. So Vietnam's economy is a great success story. One of the fastest growing economies over the last decade, close to 6.7% every year, or average in the last decade. One of the best performers globally. Vietnam has gotten quite well through COVID. What has Vietnam done right? I should say I worked on Vietnam before, 10 years ago. So I've seen a little bit the progression as well over the last 10 years. In my opinion, one key element for Vietnam is to focus on good basic education. When you look at outcomes at the middle school, high school level in Vietnam really stands out among developing countries. PISA scores, this OECD test, for example, for high school students, Vietnamese students score similar to Korea and China and way above most Southeast Asian countries. And that's a big factor. When I meet very large foreign direct investment investors in Vietnam, they usually mention the workforce. That's just one of the drivers of the economy. Also, good investment in basic public services, functioning healthcare, for example. That has economic consequences if you have a healthy workforce. Then decent investment in infrastructure has been important. A focus on macro stability over the last 10 years. So a relatively conservative fiscal policy, low debt levels, nothing crazy. They didn't print money, inflation under control. So good bread and butter macro policies. That's really a basic ingredient for stable economic growth. And then the key factor is openness to FDI. Vietnam has ridden the FDI wave. A lot of growth has simply come from being an attractive destination for foreign direct investment. And that really has helped. And another factor, demographics have been a tailwind for Vietnam over the last decade. Now, when we look ahead for the next 10 years or 20 years, I think Vietnam will continue to do well, but it will get much harder. Demographics, as of now, are not a benefit to growth anymore in Vietnam. In fact, in the next years, demographics will actually be a negative for growth. The other thing that we've done some recent analysis on long-term growth trends here is a lot of growth in Vietnam has been driven by capital investment, pouring concrete into the ground, building things. Productivity actually has been very low in Vietnam once you account for human capital deepening. So education. Once you take out education, productivity of investment is very, very low. And going forward, that's going to be a problem for Vietnam if they want to maintain these 6.5+ growth rates. Now, as demographics turn into a headwind, more of the growth needs to come from productivity. And I think the government understands that quite clearly, the people I'm talking to. And raising productivity is very difficult. It needs structural reforms. It needs, I think, here in Vietnam, especially a reform of the financial system, capital markets, better allocation of capital, less waste, less wasted credit. Vietnam will continue to do well, but the question, I think, is will Vietnam grow around 5, 5.5, or 6.5 in the next 10 years? And 6.5 is only within reach with some new deep structural reforms.
Thank you, Jochen. Thank you, Richard. Any other questions from student side? So one question.
I see a question on a global recession. I'm happy to take that. So we are not predicting a global recession, and global recession is actually a bit hard to define because for global growth to turn negative, things would have to be really bad. We would have a COVID scenario. So you can't really define recession on a global scale like you do in specific countries where growth turns negative. But let's say, is there a chance for global growth to dip substantially to 2%? I would say where we stand now, and with all the caveats of the difficulties of forecasting, this is definitely not our baseline or main scenario right now. Recent economic indicators have actually been quite strong, or at least there has been less of a slowdown that we would have thought. And as I mentioned in the presentation, there are a variety of reasons why growth has held up quite well, despite central banks raising interest rates. So now, as inflation comes under control and central banks start lowering interest rates, so this is really the question, can they engineer a soft landing? Can they get into a situation where inflation comes further down without growth really materially decelerating? And it's hard to predict, but I think this is, for now, it's the baseline, that a soft landing seems to be the most likely outcome and not a recession. Now, how does it impact various regions differently? Yeah, that's a bit tough to say because the impacts will be, it really depends which countries are particularly hard hit. If the US goes into recession, it really affects everybody because it's such a big economy, especially also will affect Asia because so much of Asia's exports, including from Vietnam, are going to the US. So it really depends where the slowdown occurs the most and how deep it will be. And there also, it depends what kind of recession. If it's just a normal mild recession, that's very different from a deep recession, such as the one we saw during the global financial crisis or during COVID. Mild recessions are much easier to handle. Yeah, this is a very specific question here. I don't want to go into the details, many different models on forecasting. Yeah. We do global forecasts using all kinds of quantitative models, machine learning models now. We do bottom-up forecasts, so we forecast for each country that we then aggregate, and then we try to reconcile both the global forecasts with the bottom-up forecasts. But again, forecasting economic data beyond a few quarters is very difficult. And in my experience, the simpler models tend to do better. So oftentimes a simple AR model outperforms more sophisticated things.